Thank you for watching Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Budnam. I am thankful to all news resources. Following are the news which have been reported by American, European and Canadian channels. African, Asian channels and all news agencies have reported the same news. Now the news in detail. Putin has won elections in Russia with more than 80% of majority. There is still no solution for Haiti problems. Biden tried to convince Israeli leader Netanyahu for ceasefire and Rafah action. UN Secretary General also appealed for ceasefire. North Korea tested short-range missiles. Trump in New York court regarding hush money case and under trouble for his controversial remarks. On Wall Street, everything goes up. Dow Jones Industrial, Nasdaq and S&P 500 all went up. Kate Middleton outing. Now the news in detail.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. On the NewsHour tonight, Russia's Vladimir Putin extends his presidency after securing a preordained fifth term.
A look at former President Donald Trump's violent language on the campaign trail.
And why federal housing assistance is shrinking. At the same time, rental prices and homelessness are at historic highs.
It's essentially a lottery. Those who are very lucky will get assistance, everyone else gets nothing.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Leonard and Norma Glorfine, and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation.
Actually, you don't need vision to do most things in life. Yes, I'm legally blind, and yes, I'm responsible for the user interface. Data visualization. If I can see it and understand it quickly, anyone can. It's exciting to be part of a team driving the technology forward. I think that's the most rewarding thing. People who know BDO.
Two retiring executives turn their focus to greyhounds, giving these former race dogs a real chance to win. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your purpose, and the way you give back. Life well planned.
The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years, advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. We begin tonight with two major stories. One related to the 2024 presidential election. The other focused on an election held just this past weekend in Russia.
Today in Moscow, President Vladimir Putin declared his intention to advance deeper into Ukraine and issued new threats against the West, one day after he secured his fifth term in office. It was an election with no suspense, the outcome of which was preordained. Here now is Nick Schifrin.
In Moscow tonight, a celebration and coronation. Tens of thousands in Red Square mark the 10th anniversary of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the man who many call a czar. Last night, Vladimir Putin declared victory with supporters, some who weren't alive when he was appointed president in 1999. He will soon surpass Joseph Stalin to become the longest-running Russian leader since Catherine the Great.
People came to create the conditions for internal political consolidation, to move forward for development and the strengthening of their fatherland, Russia.
Putin's nearly 88% of the vote and record 77% turnout made this a Potemkin plebiscite, especially since at least one city offered voters a chance to win expensive Western electronics, and another offered motorcycles and even apartments. And Putin has launched the harshest crackdown on dissent since the Soviet Union. Putin critics say the country has moved from authoritarian to a dictatorship. But some Russian voters, especially those old enough to remember the chaos of the 1990s, say Putin symbolizes a successful effort to make Russia great again.
I'm interested in what is being done now, and I would like it to be continued and even improved, because the younger generation must live in peace and harmony.
Putin's critics call that propaganda and voted with gasoline and a match, including one woman who lit her own ballot after writing, "Bring my husband back." Those who believe the ballot was already spoiled an entire box, and others wrote in one name, Navalny. Alexei Navalny, the country's leading opposition figure before he died in mysterious circumstances in prison, had called for Russians to protest by all voting at the same time. And they showed up for noon against Putin, as seen on this video posted by Navalny's team. Strength through numbers. That included expats in Berlin, where Navalny's widow Yulia, who'd echoed her husband's protest call, waited for 6 hours to vote. For Putin, Navalny had been he who must not be named until today, when he said he was willing to include Navalny in a prisoner swap.
On one condition only, I said, so he doesn't come back. But things happen. There's nothing you can do about it.
Even before the elections, we knew that the numbers, that there should be more than 80% people vote for him.
Alexandra Prokopenko is with the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center and was the advisor to the central bank's deputy governor before leaving to protest the Ukraine war. She says Russia's economy is unhealthy, but has avoided failure despite Western sanctions, thanks to Chinese and Indian willingness to buy Russian oil and massive military spending.
Next 12-18 months are decisive for Ukraine from the pure military standpoint. In terms of this time frame, Putin has enough money to finance the war, to continue and maintain lavish payments on population during this timeline, and probably to keep inflation moderate.
But there is nothing moderate about Putin, who gets another turn to continue the policies that define his Russia, a nation at war with freedom and its citizens. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Former President Donald Trump is under fire again for comments made during a controversial speech at a campaign event for a Republican Ohio Senate candidate. Extremism experts say it's the latest example of Donald Trump using violent rhetoric to appeal to his supporters. At a campaign rally in Ohio Saturday, a tribute to those charged and convicted of crimes connected to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol.
Please rise for the horribly and unfairly treated January 6th hostages.
And a vow from the former president to release them.
We're going to work with the people to treat those unbelievable patriots.
As his use of the word bloodbath during an extended riff on the auto industry and Chinese automakers sparked fresh controversy and criticism.
We're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars if I get elected. Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
In a social media post today, Mr. Trump said his threat had been taken out of context and turned the defense of his comments into a fundraising appeal. Former President Trump also facing criticism for his dehumanizing anti-immigrant rhetoric at that same rally.
If I had prisons that were teeming with MS-13 and all sorts of people that they've got to take care of for the next 50 years, right? Young people, they're in jail for years. If you call them people, I don't know if you call them people. In some cases, they're not people, in my opinion.
And in a Fox News interview Sunday, he doubled down on past comments about migrants that echoed dictators.
Why do you use words like vermin and poisoning of the blood? The press, as you know, immediately reacts to that by saying, well, that's the kind of language that Hitler and Mussolini used.
Well, that's what they say. I didn't know that, but that's what they say. Because our country is being poisoned.
Experts who study extremism say the former president's bloodbath remark is part of an escalating campaign of violent rhetoric.
In this case, it may have been a metaphor. It's hard to tell with him. He was using that language in the context of a discussion of the auto industry, but his meaning was ambiguous. Given the way he so frequently calls for or endorses violence, I think it's appropriate to be concerned when he invokes it even in a seemingly metaphorical way.
Dartmouth College political science professor Brendan Nyhan has closely followed Mr. Trump's commentary about immigrants over the last decade. He says Donald Trump's rhetoric should be viewed through an historical lens.
Donald Trump's descriptions of people from other countries and other racial and ethnic groups as subhuman animals is the kind of language we see in countries before they have ethnic violence or even genocide. It's the kind of language we see when authoritarian movements rise to power. He's appealing to the worst aspects of humanity. It's straight out of the textbooks, and we should be very worried with how mundane it now seems.
President Biden's campaign, in a statement responding to Donald Trump's rally remarks, said, quote, he wants another January 6th, but the American people are going to give him another electoral defeat this November because they continue to reject his extremism, his affection for violence, and his thirst for revenge. In the day's other headlines, former President Trump's lawyers say he cannot post the bond to cover a civil fraud judgment of $454 million in New York. The penalty is for inflating his wealth in his business dealings. Today, his lawyers told an appeal court that, quote, obtaining an appeal bond in the full amount is not possible under the circumstances. Mr. Trump has until March 25th to pay the full judgment or win a delay. Otherwise, the state could start seizing his assets. A Texas law that gives police broad powers to arrest undocumented migrants is going to stay on hold for now. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito extended a temporary pause indefinitely today. That gives more time to resolve the law's final fate. The Biden administration says it usurps federal authority. Texas officials say the border crisis affects Texans more than anyone else. President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke by phone today amid a growing rift over Israel's handling of the war in Gaza. White House officials say the Prime Minister agreed to send a delegation to Washington to discuss a planned assault on Rafah in southern Gaza, something the President opposes.
This is not a question of defeating Hamas. And anytime I hear an argument that says, if you don't smash into Rafah, you can't defeat Hamas, I say that is a straw man. Our view is that there are ways for Israel to prevail in this conflict, to secure its long-term future, to end the terror threat from Gaza, and not smash into Rafah.
More than 1.5 million Palestinians are sheltering in Rafah. So far, though, Netanyahu has insisted the attack must go forward. Inside Gaza, Israeli forces raided the Shifa hospital complex in Gaza City, where some 30,000 Palestinians are sheltering. The Israelis said senior Hamas leaders had regrouped there. They said they killed 20 gunmen, including a Hamas commander. The military released video of the fighting and said troops were instructed on avoiding harm to civilians, but the Gaza Health Ministry reported there were deaths and injuries. A coalition of a dozen governments and UN agencies is warning famine in northern Gaza is imminent. Their report today estimated up to 300,000 people could face starvation by May. But in New York, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the worst is still preventable.
This is an entirely man-made disaster, and the report makes clear that it can be halted. I call on the Israeli authorities to ensure complete and unfettered access for humanitarian goods throughout Gaza, and for the international community to fully support our humanitarian efforts.
In response, Israel's foreign minister accused Hamas of violently interfering with attempts to send aid into Gaza. North Korea fired several short-range ballistic missiles into the sea today. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in South Korea. Blinken met with his counterpart in Seoul and joined South Korea's president for a democracy summit. It came days after the South wrapped joint military drills with the U.S. Here at home, the EPA has announced a ban on the last type of asbestos being used in the U.S. It's still employed in making chlorine bleach, car brakes, and some construction materials. Asbestos is known to cause a number of cancers and is linked to more than 40,000 American deaths each year. The National Institutes of Health reports advanced new studies have found no evidence of brain injuries from so-called Havana syndrome. It also offers no explanation for the headaches, balance, and sleeping problems first reported by U.S. embassy staffers in Cuba back in 2016. A lead researcher says what is clear is that these individuals have real symptoms. They can be quite profound, disabling, and difficult to treat. And on Wall Street, tech stocks led the broader market higher to start the week. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 75 points to close at 38,790. The Nasdaq rose 130 points. The S&P 500 added 32. Still to come on the NewsHour, the Supreme Court hears two cases with major implications for free speech. Tamara Keith and Amy Walter break down the latest political headlines. And a teacher's brief but spectacular take on harnessing artificial intelligence in schools.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
We return now to the Russian elections and what Vladimir Putin's continued rule means for Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the world. Nick Schifrin has more.
Thank you. Joining me now is Fiona Hill. She was the Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council staff during the Trump administration. She's now a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and the author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. And Yevgenia Kara-Murza is Advocacy Director at the Free Russia Foundation.
Free democratic country. So Vladimir, sitting in this solitary punishment cell in Western Siberia, sends us words of support and encouragement.
Yevgenia Kara-Murza, Fiona Hill, thank you very much to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
The First Amendment was at the center of two key Supreme Court arguments today. One focused on social media companies' handling of misinformation, while the powerful gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, was at the center of another. Our Supreme Court analyst, Marsha Coyle, joins us now. It's always great to see you. So as we said, two big arguments. The first one was about social media companies and whether the Biden administration violated years at the U.S. Supreme Court. Thanks as always.
My pleasure, Jeff. For more on Donald Trump's escalating violent rhetoric, how lawmakers are responding, and the political headlines driving the week, we turn now to our Politics Monday team. That is Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. Great to see you both, as always. Yeah. So you saw Jeff's report earlier on that violent rhetoric we're hearing from former President Trump, even after Mr. Trump has confronted Biden. Already a busy week. Tamara Keith, Amy Walter, always good to see you both. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Unlike other social safety net programs that continue to expand, federal housing assistance has shrunk to its lowest level in nearly 25 years, even as homelessness and rental prices have hit historic highs. Today, only 1 in 4 households eligible to receive federal housing assistance actually does. Stephanie Tsai and producer Mike Fritz take a look at why, as part of our ongoing series, America's Safety Net.
They're asking $18.25 a month. Oh, that's really low. In Mesquite, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, 36-year-old Cassie Williams and her 2 children need to fight.
As a New York City high school English teacher, Adrian Anteo has embraced technology to support his students. While some express concern about the influence of AI on education, Anteo has worked with educators, coders, and designers to develop an AI tool that helps students with their writing revisions. He shares his brief but spectacular take on harnessing AI in schools.
Here it is, the argument that said, it's a yes-no question that needs an answer in the intro. Because I've taught for close to 20 years, I've taught almost every English class the school has offered.
In the report on the warnings of imminent famine in Gaza and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's fight to keep his grip on power. And that is the News Hour for tonight. I'm Amna Navaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. Thanks for joining us, and have a good evening.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
France 24, your window on the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Israel's planned offensive in Rafah raises concerns and obliges the United States to call for a meeting at the White House to discuss Netanyahu's pledge. Over 1 million residents are sheltering in devastating conditions in Gaza's southern city. In his sweeping victory speech, the newly re-elected Russian president announced an intention to carve out a buffer zone in Ukraine to protect Russia and make it out of range from cross-border shelling and attacks. And Haiti has been engulfed for the past 3 weeks in gang violence. Despite the Prime Minister stepping aside, chaos continues. One affluent suburb of Port-au-Prince has been under attack by armed criminals, leaving 14 people dead. Hello, welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged to push into Rafah despite warnings that a military ground operation in Gaza's southern city would deepen anarchy in the Strip. More than half of the territory's 2.3 million people are sheltering there in dire humanitarian conditions. According to Gaza's health ministry, over 31,000 people have been killed since the assault began over 5 months ago. The White House says that there will be a meeting in Washington to find alternatives to the plan. Our correspondent Fraser Jackson has the details.
Amid growing signs of frustration between Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the pair held their first official telephone call in over a month on Monday. The character of that call pushed back upon by the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. There had been rumours that it was quite a tense call and that it ended abruptly. Jake Sullivan pushed back on that and said that it was, quote, businesslike. However, one of the main focuses of that call was Israel's planned offensive into the southern Gaza town of Rafah, where 1.5 million people are currently seeking refuge. The Israelis agreed to Joe Biden's suggestion that they send a delegation to Washington to hear Washington's concerns. Jake Sullivan said President Biden asked the Prime Minister to send a senior agency team composed of military, intelligence and humanitarian officials to Washington in the coming days. Now, it is understood that that team could be in place by the end of this week, if not the beginning of next week, and that no offensive into Gaza, into the Rafah area, will take place until the US concerns have been heard. Jake Sullivan calling this next step a, quote, natural evolution of discussions between partners. It also came up about Chuck Schumer, the top Democrat in the Senate's comments about Netanyahu just a few days ago. He called him a, quote, obstacle to peace, and also said that fresh elections should be held. That was brought up by Netanyahu. We are told Jake Sullivan said that the Prime Minister did raise concerns about a variety of things that came out in the American press, but he did not talk specifically about any one issue. So the United States here seemingly taking a more active role in the Israeli military planning. They say they're not getting involved directly, but rather in an advisory role. Also, more discussed about humanitarian aid into Gaza. We are still expecting that humanitarian pier off the coast of Gaza to be constructed between the next 45 to 60 days, although the US is hoping that will happen sooner than that.
Fraser Jackson there reporting for us from Washington, D.C. Well, extreme food shortages in parts of Gaza have exceeded famine levels. This, according to the Global Hunger Monitor. If there is no immediate ceasefire and no food distribution in areas cut off by fighting, then there will be a large scale of deaths. Take a listen.
In last December, the IPC was already then warning that famine could break out by May. Today's findings, just to underscore this again, affirm and indicate that in the northern governorates of Gaza, famine could break out at any time.
Meanwhile, Israel has announced the death of 20 members of Hamas, as well as the capture of dozens of others while attacking the Al-Shifa hospital in the northern part of Gaza. The hospital directors, as well as the organization, deny all accusations of using the building as a hideout. The UN says that most of the besieged enclaves hospitals are no longer functioning. This latest raid on the Strip's largest hospital has triggered alarm for the World Health Organization. Thomas Wahler has more.
Explosions and continuous gunfire in Gaza City, captured on film by civilians. On Monday, the Israeli army once again raided Al-Shifa hospital, claiming that Hamas militants were operating from within the compound. Explosions and distant flames could be seen in the videos, while gunfire and loudspeaker commands could be heard in the background.
Fighting at the Al-Shifa complex has been going on since 2:30 a.m. Of course, the fate of those inside Al-Shifa is unknown, because the occupation took their mobiles and all communication tools.
Also on Monday, the military released a video showing weapons and money it says were seized from the hospital, which had been used by Hamas and another armed group.
A gift from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Good work.
It also released these images, which Tel Aviv says shows shots being fired at Israeli soldiers in an area of the hospital. The military said it was conducting a high-precision operation in parts of the medical complex after intelligence indicated senior Hamas militants had regrouped there and were directing attacks from the compound. Both Hamas and Al-Shifa hospital directors have denied the Israeli allegations.
In other world news, speaking of the back of his re-election, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said he plans to create a buffer zone to help protect Russia from Ukrainian strikes. Although the Kremlin's forces have made progress after more than 2 years of war, it hasn't stopped Kyiv from firing at oil refineries and depots deep inside Russia. Putin considers it necessary to create a certain sanitary zone on the territories controlled by Ukraine. Catherine Kadir-Clifford has more.
In Belgorod and Kursk, oil refineries captured in flames as Kyiv stepped up its long-range drone strikes deep into Russian territory last week. Speaking in the wake of his electoral victory, Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened that the only way to protect his country was to create a security zone.
We will be forced at some point, when we deem it appropriate, to create a certain sanitary zone in the current territories under Kyiv's regime's control. To create a security zone that will be quite difficult to cross with the means of destruction that the enemy is using, primarily, of course, a foreign manufacture.
The front line stretches over 1,000 kilometers across eastern and southern Ukraine. The president did not provide further details on how such a zone would be implemented. A Ukrainian presidential aide said the statement was evidence that the war will only escalate. On the streets of Kyiv, Putin's announcement was met with little surprise.
It's nothing new, because we know that Putin's goal is to totally destroy our country. The only thing that can give us hope is the position of Western leaders.
For now, Western support isn't sufficient. Ukrainian troops lack vital military supplies, above all ammunition. French President Emmanuel Macron said he wouldn't rule out the possibility of sending allied troops to Ukraine, an idea rebuffed by several NATO allies.
Haiti has been engulfed for the past 3 weeks in gang violence, and since Ariel Henry has agreed to step aside to allow an interim government, the situation remains dire. At least 14 people were killed in an affluent suburb of Port-au-Prince that had been under attack by armed criminals. Since dawn, there were reports of looting and thefts. Eliza Herbert has the latest.
Collective grief and fear have overwhelmed Pétionville on the outskirts of Port-au-Prince. Several lifeless bodies were found in the streets on Monday after the neighbourhood came under attack.
These victims were people who were just looking to feed their children in the evening before going home. They're the ones who come home late. Among them, there are public transport drivers who have left more than 5 children behind. I recognise some of them.
While the details of what took place are still unclear, many locals say that armed bandits had been spreading terror in the area since the morning.
Last night around 11 p.m. as we were sitting here, 2 young boys suddenly appeared and opened fire on our brothers. They didn't address anyone. They just came up and started shooting.
It's one of the latest incidents in the ongoing political and humanitarian crisis that is raging in Haiti, after a recent surge in gang violence plunged the nation into chaos. According to UNICEF, Haitians trapped by violence are suffering from famine and malnutrition, and humanitarian aid is hard to deliver. At an emergency meeting last week, representatives from the UN, United States and the Caribbean, among others, created a blueprint for Haitians to form a transitional authority, which would govern the country until elections can be held. They hope the authority will lead the country out of crisis, but humanitarian groups fear it is sliding towards civil war.
The Ocean Viking vessel has finally arrived at the port of Ancona after carrying out 4 rescue missions during its journey of nearly 1,500 kilometers across the Mediterranean. On board are 336 migrants, among them 32 unaccompanied minors and 31 women. Most are Syrians, Egyptians, Pakistanis and Malaysians. This is the highest number of migrants ever landed in the dark port from a single boat. Well, here in France, security forces have been deployed in numbers after a turbulent night Sunday in the Paris suburb of La Courneuve. Around 50 people threw stones and Molotov cocktails at the police station to voice their anger at the death of a young man from the neighbourhood. 18-year-old Vanis died last week in a collision with the police after refusing to stop his bike when being chased after. Charlotte Hughes has the story.
The attack lasted around half an hour. Some 50 people launched fireworks and Molotov cocktails at a police station in the Paris suburb of La Courneuve. Police responded with tear gas and crowd control weapons. Paris's police chief said several people were arrested, including 2 minors, and that 2 police officers were likely injured.
There is obviously a link with what happened in Aubervilliers. I can confirm that. In fact, a number of attackers last night referred to this, so we will obviously continue to be very much involved.
Last week in Aubervilliers, not far from La Courneuve, 18-year-old Wenis was killed in a collision with a police car. The incident occurred during a police chase after Wenis refused to stop his motorbike. Almost 9 months after riots in the Paris region following the death of Naël, a teenager killed by a police officer during a traffic stop, authorities fear unrest could break out again, months ahead of the Olympics.
These outbursts do not do justice to anyone. It's justice that the family needs, and our country needs. Because this isn't the first time, we know that under these circumstances, transparency is needed to encourage the calm that everyone really wants.
The lawyer for Wenis' family accused the police of deliberately colliding with him. 2 investigations have been launched, one for aggravated refusal to comply, and one for manslaughter and involuntary injury. The officer's representative argues that it was an accident.
And finally, the Michelin Guide has unveiled its annual list of the best French restaurants, praising a new generation of chefs, among them very few women. Out of the 6 who earned a star is Eugénie Béziat. She grew up in Gabon and has been inspired by the African delicacies that are now a main feature among her very innovative dishes at the Ritz Hotel restaurant, the Espadon.
You have to persevere in this vocation. You have to keep going. You have to inspire young women. I've got some in my team. We've got some in the restaurant. As long as you've got talent, there's a place for everyone. It's as simple as that. Well, talent as long as you work hard, I'd say.
And big congrats to her. Thank you for watching France 24. Stay tuned. More news coming up very shortly.
Hello and welcome to Tête à Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is
On this Monday night, a dire warning about a deepening crisis. More than 1 million people in Gaza face famine.
This is an entirely man-made disaster.
As Canada's MPs vote on whether to recognize Palestine as a state. New predictions about the potential spread of measles in Canada.
It is an extremely transmissible infection.
The other vaccine-preventable illnesses also making a comeback. Trump's money troubles, how the billionaire cannot post his multi-million-dollar bond. Plus, the hype and hope hydrogen is a fuel of the future, why critics aren't sold on Canada's strategy.
Global National with Donna Friesen, reporting tonight. Ritu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. MPs are back at work and they're debating a major change to Canada's foreign policy. The NDP has put forward a motion calling on Canada to officially recognize Palestine as a state. It's part of a series of initiatives the party believes could expedite peace in Gaza and across the Middle East. Our David Aiken has been watching tonight's developments in the House of Commons. And David, there's been a last-minute negotiation between the New Democrats and the Liberals.
There has been, Neetu, and it's still very much up in the air, and really it all revolves around this. For 50 years, across governments of all stripes, it has been a cornerstone of Canada's Middle East policy that Canada supports a two-state solution, and that the state of Palestine can only come into existence through negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. The NDP today tried to change that policy.
By doing so, and in lockstep with our allies, we believe that such a move can help accelerate a much-needed diplomatic process to revive two-state negotiations.
It was an idea the federal Conservatives rejected.
Why is the member rewarding Hamas terrorists for their October 7th massacre in this House of Commons? She should be ashamed of herself.
But despite the Conservatives' objections, MPs from all other parties were ready to vote in favor of the NDP proposal of unilateral recognition of Palestine.
Le Bloc québécois va appuyer la motion.
That included many liberal backbench MPs.
Either we stand for human rights everywhere and for everyone, or we don't. I will be voting in favor of this motion. I urge my colleagues to do the same.
But the vote would have split the Liberal caucus, many of whom opposed unilateral recognition.
There's a difference between shouting from the sidelines and governing the country, and this motion is stoking anger and pain among Canadians.
And so, after a day of often emotional debate, a last-minute compromise was reached.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the motion be amended as follows. A.
And that motion, that amendment coming just minutes before the vote in the House of Commons, would have essentially taken away what the NDP had proposed, watered down their motion, and essentially asked the House to reaffirm that cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy, which is Canada believes in a two-state solution that needs to be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians. All that debate all day long, really to take the government back to where it started. Neither.
All right, thanks very much for that. That is David Aiken in Ottawa. There's an urgent warning tonight about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with a new report showing that famine is imminent. The UN Secretary General says a UN-backed report on hunger in Gaza is an appalling indictment of conditions on the ground for civilians. 1.1 million people, about half of Gaza's population, are facing catastrophic hunger. In the northern Gaza Strip, famine is expected between now and May, and an estimated 300,000 people have no access to adequate humanitarian aid. Israeli troops raided Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital overnight. The Israeli military says 20 gunmen were killed in what it called an operation to thwart terrorist activity. The Hamas-run health ministry says the attack sparked a fire and led to multiple casualties. Hamas and hospital officials have denied claims by Israel that Al-Shifa is being used as a base for its operations. Al-Shifa is housing hundreds of displaced civilians. It's also one of the only operational healthcare facilities in the north, where hundreds of thousands of people are facing severe levels of malnutrition and starvation. Redmond Shannon reports.
A UN food warehouse in Gaza City, one of the few places in northern Gaza with supplies. People are hungry. People will die. Look at what is happening for 5 kilos of flour, says this woman. She is among the 300,000 people in northern Gaza. A United Nations-backed report says famine is set to happen there over the next 2 months. The UN and many non-governmental organizations define famine as at least 20% of the population suffering from extreme food shortages, along with 1 in 3 children being acutely malnourished, and when 2 out of every 10,000 people are dying daily from starvation or malnutrition. The report says half of Gazans, 1.1 million people, are facing catastrophic hunger.
This is the highest number of people facing catastrophic hunger ever recorded by the Integrated Food Security Classification System, anywhere, anytime. This is an entirely man-made disaster, and the report makes clear that it can be halted.
The European Union's top diplomat says Israel is, quote, provoking famine by blocking aid.
Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Yes, the starvation is used as a weapon of war. Let's say that.
The document says all fighting must stop immediately to allow the required 300 trucks of food to enter Gaza every day.
What they're actually saying is, don't win the war, which means lose the war. That's what it means.
On Monday, Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with US President Joe Biden on topics that include peace talks and Israel's plans to invade the crowded city of Rafah.
The president has rejected, and did again today, the straw man that raising questions about Rafah is the same as raising questions about defeating Hamas. That's just nonsense.
The White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also says the US now believes that Israel killed Marwan Issa, one of Hamas's top commanders, earlier this month. Meanwhile, in Qatar, peace negotiations continue this week. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
In Haiti, at least 12 people have been killed when gangs attacked upscale neighborhoods on the outskirts of the country's capital. A warning, the images in this story are disturbing. Gunmen attacked and looted homes overnight in 2 communities in Port-au-Prince that had largely avoided the escalating gang violence. It's the latest in a string of attacks that have worsened across the country despite the resignation of the Prime Minister. Residents are facing a shortage of food and medical care. The Canadian Embassy has already withdrawn most of its staff from the capital city. A day after Russia's election, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister condemned it as non-democratic and a blatant breach of international law. This after Russian President Vladimir Putin won a 5th term in office. Putin celebrated his victory at a Moscow rally marking 10 years since Russia illegally annexed Crimea. Even his election opponents were on stage to congratulate him. Putin also spoke about the war on Ukraine, calling it more grave and tragic than Crimea's annexation. But he claimed his so-called special military operation is succeeding in its objectives. The election was tightly controlled by the Kremlin and widely believed to be rigged, with many of Putin's most vocal critics either exiled, imprisoned, or dead. Some European countries are trying to reduce their reliance on Russian fossil fuels. It's also part of a global effort to find cleaner energy in general. And there's plenty of hype surrounding hydrogen, which Canada is also banking on. Today, Ottawa signed a memorandum of understanding with Germany to export Canadian hydrogen overseas. Heidi Petracek looks at whether this fuel of the future will pay off.
In Hamburg, Germany, this metal recycling plant could one day be powered by Canadian hydrogen. A new bilateral agreement is building on Ottawa's plan to sell hydrogen from proposed production plants in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia to German customers.
To work together to fight climate change, but also to enhance energy security.
Hydrogen leaves behind only water when it burns. How clean it is depends on how it's produced. So-called green hydrogen is created using renewable resources like wind.
Taking a bunch of wind energy, using it to create hydrogen, and that could actually delay the province's transition off of coal.
Transporting hydrogen is also costly, emitting carbon, and requires ammonia, which is often used for plastics. For some, the price is too high.
So this is all really just about building out supply chains that aren't about dealing with the climate crisis.
But Ottawa insists cleaner energy is the plan, offering millions of dollars in export development loans and tax credits, and funding research to explore making hydrogen a fuel of the future. At this Dalhousie University lab, scientists are trying to determine the right mix of hydrogen and natural gas for highest efficiency and lowest emissions in common household appliances like hot water heaters and stoves.
The question is, are we going to be able to produce enough hydrogen at an economic level?
But I would say that where countries like Canada and Germany are starting are industrial processes that already use natural gas.
2 years ago, Canada's Auditor General found Natural Resources Canada based its hydrogen strategy on, quote, overly confident assumptions. That confidence now to be put to the test in the government's plan to see Canadian hydrogen head to Germany by 2026. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
There is growing concern about measles in Canada. Quebec has now confirmed 29 cases this year, and there's a new case in Toronto in an infant, bringing Canada's total number of cases this year to roughly 40. With many families traveling for March break, there is worry the highly contagious disease could spread quickly, especially in areas with low vaccine uptake. Heather Urex West reports.
A Toronto infant is behind the country's latest case of imported measles. Officials say the baby had just returned home from a trip abroad. It's the city's second confirmed case this year, but across the country, experts are concerned with the number of cases Canada is seeing so far.
It's only March, but we're already seeing tallies that resemble what we've seen from the entire year before.
As one of the world's most transmissible diseases, under the right circumstances, a small number of cases can become several hundred very fast. The only thing stopping its spread is vaccine.
Canada has overall quite high vaccine coverage for MMR, around 90% for measles immunity, but there are schools and regions where coverage is a lot lower than that.
Using mathematical models, a team at Simon Fraser University looked at what would happen if those regions were exposed. The model suggests that within communities under 1,000 people, a measles outbreak could become out of control once vaccine coverage falls below 65%, with the potential of hundreds of cases when less than 55% are immunized. But within larger communities, above 8,000 people, even 70% vaccine coverage may not be enough to prevent an outbreak from spreading to hundreds of cases.
I think the more worrisome thing is what's happening globally. We know there's a large global resurgence of measles, and that means we're just at greater risk of importing cases into Canada.
Europe has seen exponential spread of measles in the last 2 years. There were 941 cases reported in 2022, 30,000 in 2023. 2024 could be even worse. But measles isn't the only vaccine-preventable illness making a return. Southern Alberta is experiencing an outbreak of pertussis, or whooping cough, because immunization rates there have fallen dangerously low. Health officials are hoping the spread of both diseases will serve as a warning. The time to get immunized is now. Heather Urex West, Global News, Calgary.
MPs and Inuit leaders are seeking more than $131 million over 7 years to help eradicate tuberculosis in Inuit communities. Leaders are asking the Liberals to honor a promise they made in 2018 to eradicate TB in the North by 2030. The rate of this serious disease among Inuit people is nearly 700 times higher than among Canadian-born non-Indigenous residents. TB infects the lungs but is treatable and preventable. Donald Trump can't post bond while he appeals a fraud case. Coming up, what could happen if he misses next week's deadline? Plus, Sports Illustrated scores some good news. Despite long claiming to be a billionaire, former U.S. President Donald Trump is acknowledging serious financial trouble in the $454 million civil fraud case against him. In a new court filing, Trump's lawyers say he's been unable to raise the $500 million needed to post bond while he appeals the penalty. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Prosco joins us now. Jackson, what could this mean for Trump?
Hi, Neetu. The language in today's court filing is really quite stunning. Trump's lawyers are saying that he faces insurmountable difficulties in raising that $454 million bond for his New York fraud conviction. And this, of course, comes just weeks after he was forced to obtain a $91 million bond to cover that settlement with writer E. Jean Carroll. Through the court filing, we learned that Trump was rejected by nearly 30 potential sureties. Many of them were among the largest insurance companies in the world, but not a single one was prepared to underwrite a bond that size. And every single company rejected Trump's proposal to use his real estate as some form of collateral. Now, the judgment against Trump came in February after a New York judge ruled he committed fraud by falsely inflating the value of his assets. Trump has failed to win an extension to the 30-day deadline to meet his bond obligations, which he must do in order to file an appeal. The court's also rejected Trump's offer of a smaller $100 million bond payment. What does this mean in practical terms? Well, by next Monday, if Trump hasn't posted bond, his appeal is dead, and New York's Attorney General can start seizing his assets and properties.
Now that the judgment is final and there's no appellate bond that's been filed or cash deposited with the court, what Letitia James can do is attach and sell Trump's property. That's the most likely way she's going to enforce the judgment.
And Jackson, why would insurance companies be so wary of helping someone like Donald Trump?
You know, there's two things going on here. One is the amount of money he's asking for. It's about 4 times more than the maximum that most insurance companies would underwrite. But the bigger issue might be the liability that could come with backing a presidential candidate. Few companies want the risk of potentially having to enforce a bond against someone who could be the next president of the United States. You too?
All right, Jackson Prosco in Washington. Thanks, Jackson. The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in a crucial First Amendment case today. It is reviewing whether the Biden administration pressured social media platforms to censor posts promoting conservative viewpoints. The landmark case was filed by Republican lawmakers in Louisiana and Missouri. It alleges the Biden administration lobbied social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, now X, and others. The allegations are about unconstitutionally quashing or censoring inaccurate posts about the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines, and the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election results. The Supreme Court will determine whether the administration's communication with social media companies amounted to coercion. It will also examine what's being called jawboning, which is using a position of power to persuade or pressure companies to censor speech it didn't like. Sports Illustrated has averted demise after managing to find a new publisher. Digital media company Minute Media has signed a new deal with the publication's owner, Authentic Brands. They've agreed to operate the magazine for at least 10 years. There have been months of turmoil at Sports Illustrated. Most of its staff was laid off after its previous publisher failed to pay off its licensing fees. Mysterious mural. Ahead, the newest work from a world-famous British street artist. An Icelandic volcano is still spewing lava after erupting on Saturday, triggering a state of emergency and forcing residents and tourists to flee. It's the fourth time in 4 months the volcano has erupted on Iceland's southern peninsula. But authorities say the lava flows have decreased in intensity and the nearby town of Grindavik is safe for now. World-famous street artist Banksy has unveiled a new mural in London. In a social media post today, the artist confirmed the work as their own after it appeared overnight on a 4-story building. The mural features a person holding a pressure hose with green paint sprayed across the wall. When viewed from afar, the green paint mimics foliage of a barren tree in the park. Paying tribute. Next, Canadian politicians honor the legacy of Brian Mulroney. Final preparations are underway for Saturday's state funeral for former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. His family is now in Ottawa, where Mulroney will lie in state tomorrow and Wednesday morning. MPs are also back on Parliament Hill following a 2-week break, and today they paid tribute along with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Here's Mackenzie Gray.
It is not just his booming baritone that will forever echo in this chamber. Cross-partisan political praise for one of Canada's most successful politicians. He was motivated by service. And those things, those big things, have stood the test of history. 4 decades and counting. Brian Mulroney, the boy from Baie-Comeau, remembered for his upbringing in the small Quebec town.
A modest Irish working-class upbringing taught him the value of work, family, neighborhood, loyalty, and merit.
Current Bloc MP Louis Plamondon, who was a member of Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative Caucus back in 1984, lauded the former PM for bringing in the GST and rallying other nations to end apartheid in South Africa, praise echoed by the NDP.
I would be remiss not to point out that Mr. Mulroney was a progressive conservative. He respected our democracy and the role of the media in a way that wasn't remarkable at the time, but is no doubt noteworthy today.
Mulroney was voted as the Greenest Prime Minister back in 2005, in part by the Green Party's Elizabeth May, who worked for him in the 80s, focusing on fixing the ozone layer and acid rain.
Brian Mulroney quite literally saved all life on Earth when Canada stood up and organized the Montreal Protocol and saved the ozone layer.
The speech is well received by the Mulroney family.
For us sitting up in the gallery and hearing everybody speak so positively, probably not what he was used to, but he would have loved it, and we did as well.
Mulroney will now lie in state in Ottawa starting on Tuesday, before the state funeral for a Canadian political lion is held this Saturday in Montreal. Mackenzie Gray, Global News, Ottawa.
And Donna Friesen will host live coverage of Brian Mulroney's state funeral Saturday morning right here on Global. And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is this Inukshuk at Upper Arrow Lake in Nakusp, British Columbia. Thanks so much for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.